I was starting to feel, I don't know, not guilty, but just a little annoyed at the idea of paying a landlord and not getting any equity out of it. And I'm a big fan of investing in your backyard.
Hi, my name is Rob Abasolo, and I've got a unique obsession with building tiny homes. 5 years ago, I decided to try out this crazy concept where you rent out your house to strangers on this thing called Airbnb.
Anybody out there can get started in real estate. I try to make real estate approachable to the everyday person. That's my mission in all things that I do.
You're listening to the Erika Taught Me podcast, the #1 business podcast in the US, where we talk about entrepreneurship, money, and how to improve your life and achieve success. I'm your host, Erika Kullberg. I'm a lawyer and personal finance expert with over 20 million followers on social media. Today, I'm talking to Rob Abasolo, co-host of the Bigger Pockets podcast and short-term rental expert. 4 years ago, he accidentally fell into the short-term rental gig and is now making over 6 figures of passive income a year. If you're interested in real estate investing, this is the episode for you. I'm Erika Kullberg, this is Erika Taught Me, and today we're here with Rob Abasolo. So how exactly did you get started on Airbnb?
We were living in Kansas City and we wanted something more. We weren't making a ton of money. We'd always wanted to live in LA, and I was just like, let's do it. Let's move to LA. And we moved to LA and we got this 660 square foot apartment, and it was $1,850 a month. I was starting to feel, I don't know, not guilty, but just a little annoyed at the idea of paying a landlord and not getting any equity out of it, right? Like I just felt like I was throwing away money. And so I pitched the idea to my wife to buy a house. It was $624,000. Our previous house that we had sold when we bought it was $159,000. So this was a pretty big step up for us.
And at the time you had no other properties.
No, yeah. We sold our one property to move to LA. So we had nothing. Yeah. We had about $40,000 of profit from that first property. And the reason I felt like it could work was because it had this little 280 square foot studio apartment. I went into this asking, not can I afford this, but how can I afford this? And at the time I had heard about this website where you could basically rent your space to strangers and they'd pay you money for it. And obviously that website's Airbnb.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was looking at houses and trying to make them work, we just couldn't afford them. Like simple as that.
The $625,000 house was just a studio.
No, it was like a main home. And then underneath it was just like a tiny little studio.
Oh, with its own separate entrance.
Yeah, completely. It's attached, but it was just completely separate entrance, very private. You would never run into that studio.
Got it. What was the down payment for that one?
On that one, it was a 3.5% down payment. We did what's called an FHA loan, which is like a government subsidized loan. And so I think after all of our closing credits and seller credits and negotiations, we paid $18,500 out of pocket to move into that house.
Wow. So walk me through the math that you were doing with your wife when you were thinking, okay, there's this site called Airbnb that I can list it on and potentially make money from someone coming in and staying for 1 or 2 days. Walk me through that math.
Right. So just doing a calculator and seeing what my mortgage was going to be, it was going to be about $4,400. And this was back in the day when interest rates were like, 3% or something like that. Right. So it's $4,400. And I was like, all right, well, we're already paying $1,800 at the apartment. Right. So to own a home, we have to pay another $2,000 out of pocket. And so I was like, all right, I've already budgeted the $2,000, but I saw this house and it had that studio apartment. And I just started looking at neighbor Airbnbs and looking at their calendars and calculating that they were all making $2,000 to $3,000 a month. And so I was like, all right, I think it'll be like a break even, right? Like I think we'll make $2,000-3,000 on this little 279 square foot apartment. And then we were already paying the $2,000 on that apartment, on the first apartment that we had when we moved in. And so I was like, all right, that'll be like $4,000. And, we buy this house, but we still had that apartment that we had when we moved to LA. And so I was like, well, let's just put that on Airbnb. I didn't realize at the time that this was rental arbitrage. And that's effectively where you go and you rent an apartment and then sublease it on Airbnb. Now you have to get permission when you do this, right? So later on, we started doing more arbitrage and then having to pitch landlords. And that's a lot tougher whenever you're actually sitting with the landlord and having to educate them on what Airbnb was. But regardless, we put that first apartment on Airbnb that we moved into, and that was making about $1,000 to $2,000 profit every single month just from that first one.
Wow.
So between that and then the studio apartment underneath my house, that was $2,000 to $3,000. I wasn't paying a mortgage.
That's crazy. So I actually have an Airbnb story. When I was in law school, I was renting the studio and I figured, well, on weekends when I'm not as busy, maybe I can go sleep with friends or sleep in the library and rent the apartment out and make some money from it. So I was an Airbnb host for a good year or so.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
my third year
Did
of
you
law
do the
school.
cleaning or no?
Actually, yes, I was the cleaner too.
Oh, okay.
Of
Okay.
course, because I was too cheap at that time to ever pay for a cleaner. So I did everything. And my first guests, I was so good. I like got fresh flowers for them. I wrote handwritten notes to them saying like, hope you have a great time in
The
DC.
golden
I had
days.
chocolate. Like, yeah, I was a good host.
Yeah, I had a buddy who, similar story, he was in college. He had a dorm and he put that on Airbnb, and that dorm had this like basement under it. Like, and my dorm actually had a basement just like this, and it was just like dark and creaky and had like a bunch of spider webs. And it was just used for like whatever storage that they had. And so he would rent his apartment or he would rent his dorm on Airbnb and just go sleep in the basement. And he said he did that for like 50 to 75% of the year.
It was worth it though.
Yeah. For a college kid, I mean, he was making thousands a month doing it. So
Yeah.
he was living the high life for sure.
So what were kind of the early lessons that you learned as you started to Airbnb out your two places?
Yeah. So customer service is definitely a big part of it. I mean, you'll see a lot of people, and I'm part of this camp too, that do preach that Airbnb is a very passive business, but it doesn't start out that way. If you're getting your first Airbnb or your first 2 or 3 or 4, it's not passive because you're learning how to do it. And thus you're failing all the time. And I just didn't realize, I mean, back then it was actually a little easier because guests weren't quite as demanding, but I just didn't know how to automate things. So biggest lesson for me was not automating like messaging, for example. When someone gets a reservation, I would go in and I would send them a message from my phone and be like, hey, thanks for booking a reservation at my house. Here's the check-in instructions. Hope you have a great time, right? And so that's doing it manually, but there are a bunch of different systems and tools and platforms that you can go into that actually will send that on your behalf at scheduled times. And same thing with like cleaners, like I was texting my cleaners and scheduling them in. And, that's very easy to do when you have one. And then you get to 4 and 5 and you start, things start falling through the cracks, right? Like you have to send check-in instructions to people, checkout instructions, guidebooks. You have to answer their questions like confirmation messages, all that stuff, right? When you're doing that with 5 sets of guests that are all checking in and checking out on any given day, you're going to mess up all the time. That was a big lesson for me early on was how do I automate as much as I can so that I'm not in the weeds all the time.
So at that point, you were doing 2 different kinds of Airbnb, let's say. One was the rental arbitrage where you didn't own the property, but you were renting it and then you were renting it out on Airbnb to make a profit.
Correct.
And then the other was where you owned the property, but there was a part of the property where you could rent that out.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Was the other part of the property where you could live?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so that's where you and your wife were living.
Yeah, right above the tenants. It was a 2-bedroom, 1 bath on that. It's kind of a really weird configuration, but it's LA, so houses are always on hills and stuff. So the main home was like up a flight of stairs on a hill kind of thing. And then underneath it, that extra space was like a studio apartment that's like under it. So it's like the garage and then the apartment and then over that was the house.
What do you think is the easier route for people to start with? Is it the rental arbitrage or is it getting their own property that has some kind of place that you could rent out?
It's a really good question. And I think it pretty much comes down to how much money you have really getting started. So there are 2 camps of people that usually get started in the world of short-term rentals in general. There are people that don't have a ton of money, right? They have like, let's say $5,000 to $20,000 to get started. And then there are people that have money to actually invest into a property, and that could cost you anywhere from $25,000 to $200,000, $300,000, right? It's a really big range. So if you're in the camp that you only have, let's say, $10,000, then rental arbitrage is the clear route to take because you can call a landlord and pitch them on the idea of Airbnb being their property. And if they say yes, well, you're going to have to come up with first month's rent, last month's rent as a security deposit. So let's say it's $1,500. That's like $3,000. Let's say it's a 1-bedroom, 1 bath. You'll spend $6,000 to $8,000 to furnish that. And then a few other miscellaneous costs. I've already lost track of the math there, but I think it's about $10,000, right?
Yeah.
You could feasibly do that. And if you did that in a really good area, you could make, $2,000 a month like I was. So that's camp one. Camp two is you can either go and put a down payment on a property ranging from 10 to 20%. So if you're buying a $300,000 house, it could be anywhere from $30,000 to $60,000. That would be taking it more the vacation home route
Mm-hmm.
that you use for part of the year and then you rent it on Airbnb, or making it purely an investment. But actually what my wife and I were doing is one of the most simple, best ways to get into real estate, and it's house hacking. And house hacking is effectively where you rent a space or a room or a studio that's attached to your house. It doesn't have to be Airbnb. It can be. It can also be a 12-month tenant. And you use the money that they pay you to subsidize your mortgage. This to me is my favorite way to get into any type of real estate, because it allows you to get into a home for a very small amount, 3.5%. The only reason my wife and I were able to pay 3.5%, the $18,500 number that I gave you earlier, was because we were living in it. It was our primary residence. If that was an investment property, we would have paid a lot more, right? So this allows you to get into a property, you get to own it. And then if you have an extra room and you have a buddy or a friend or a coworker, whoever that needs a space to live, they can pay you $400, $500, $1,000 a month. And then that's money that you don't have to pay towards your mortgage.
That makes a lot of sense. So when you're thinking about this, I mean, what are the things that you care about? So for example, for renting out properties on Airbnb, you want to make sure that the occupancy rate is high. You don't want to try to find a place and put it up on Airbnb and have it sitting there for 26 out of 30 days, right? So what are kind of the considerations that you go through as you're looking at a property to rent out on Airbnb?
Aesthetic is really, really important. I mean, there's a lot of different niches and different types of audiences to fulfill, right? Some people are just looking for a cheap place to stay. That's what I got started in, right? I was just giving them a cheap place to stay. That side of things is a little tougher, right? They're a little tougher on the Airbnbs. There are people that need longer places. I call them medium term rentals, where people are looking to stay at your place for 30 days at a time or more. There are people that want a place with amenities in the Smoky Mountains. That's where I have a couple of cabins. It's very important to people to have a hot tub. And so your place, if it doesn't have a hot tub, you're just not going to make a lot of money. I've got 2 properties out there. One of them has a hot tub, makes a lot of money. The other one doesn't make a lot of money.
I didn't realize that. And what counts as medium-term rental?
Yeah, that's a good question. So short-term rentals typically are anything from 1 to 30 days. Really, it's like 1 to 7 days is like what a typical short-term rental is going to be. But most cities classify it as like 30 days or less. And then anything outside of that is a long-term rental. Long-term rentals are typically 9 to 12-month leases. We call them medium-term rentals because they don't typically pan out to be 9 to 12 months. They're usually a month to 3 months. Then if you're lucky, like me, like I've had for the past 5 months, you might find someone that comes in for like 6 months.
And can you charge more or less for medium-term rentals? I imagine for short-term rentals, you'll make more per night, right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's a bit of a spectrum. So usually a short-term rental is going to bring like 3 to 4 times what a long-term rental is going to bring. And then a medium-term rental is about 2 times more than what a long-term rental will be. So if you can rent something for $1,000 a month as a long-term rental, as a medium-term rental baseline, you should be able to make like $2,000.
Mm-hmm.
And then as a short-term rental, you could probably pull in anywhere from $2,500 to $4,000 a month.
So walk me through, I imagine you have a spreadsheet before you even think of entering into a project. You have a spreadsheet to run all of the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
What numbers are the most important? What are you running?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. You're trying to estimate effectively how much the debt to build the house is going to cost you. So for example, if I were going to go out and build that house right now, let's say it cost me $200K, I'd have to go borrow money to build that house, right? I don't just have the $200K sitting around that I would want to use for this, right? So if I'm going to do that, I'm going to pay interest on the $200,000 during the year that I'm building this tiny house. So I have to effectively add up all of the interest and all of those soft costs and hard costs that go into it. And then what I'm trying to calculate is, by the end of it, am I able to pull all my equity out in a refinance and effectively pay back all of the debt and all, pay myself back. And then I'm also trying to figure out how much it's going to cash flow and how much money it's going to make and if it's worth it, right? Because I don't want to be into this project for a year. I don't want to spend like $20,000, $30,000 in interest. I don't want to do all this if it's only going to make me like $500 a month, right? I mean, people do it all the time, but for me, if I'm going into a project that's going to require like, 1 to 1.5 years of my time, I want it to make me like thousands of dollars every single month. So that's something that I'm also thinking through as well. So it's pretty like, there's a lot of components there, right? Like the cost to build, how much money I'll make, can I pull my original investment back out of it?
Yeah.
So, and I say all this now, hopefully eloquently, but back then it wasn't really, I wasn't thinking through all this. I was just doing it. I when I first got started in real estate, I was like, I want to do it. So I'm going to do it. And then I'll just learn the hard way if I'm doing it wrong. And I did many, many times. But now because of it, I have my systems and my philosophies and my points of view on how to approach things.
When you were just getting started, what were the resources you were looking at? Where were you learning this information from?
At that time, there really wasn't a lot. Like I didn't have like a particular mentor. The Raw Built YouTube channel didn't exist. Like I would try to YouTube certain things, but they're just, it's not like real estate YouTubers were new or anything, like weren't existent. It just exciting ones or people that I connected with, weren't out there. Now there's like a ton of resources out there, like so many more than there were 5 years ago when I first got started doing all of this. So I was really just kind of shooting at the hip, honestly. And then like I had a couple of people that I knew that did real estate, and I would ask them questions, and sometimes they would answer, and sometimes they'd be like, "All right, you've taken advantage of my gracious time, go away," kind of thing. So really, I was just kind of figuring it. I mean, really, what I learned from a financing and lending standpoint was just from calling like 1,000 banks and like begging them to give me money.
What about like the top 3 lessons that you've learned that you think all beginner real estate investors should know?
I mean, number one is really just like the top tip that I'll give anybody, and it really is taking action. Really, I mean, there's this thing in real estate called analysis paralysis, and it's basically where you want to like do this thing. Like, let's say there's a house, and then you're like, okay, I want to buy this house and I want to flip it. And then you're like, I'm going to research it. And then you start watching YouTube and you're like, okay, I think I can do it. And then you start reading the blogs. And then you start, listening to the Bigger Pockets podcast. And then you start asking people. And now you've researched so much that you kind of hit this wall where you can't really find out the answers to certain questions without doing it. And so because you can't find those answers out, you're like, oh, is this right for me? And then you just get really stuck. That was admittedly a very long answer for what analysis paralysis is, but effectively over researching sometimes can just stop you from ever taking action in real estate. And so I am a big subscriber of the idea that you should punch a hole in the wall. This is like my favorite metaphor, where when I was doing DIY stuff at just like in the past couple of years before Airbnb and all that stuff, when I was doing like a project on a wall, I would put it off, right? And so I would just, to commit to doing the project, I would just punch a hole in the wall, right? I'd get a hammer and be like, and hit a hole into it and be like, all right, the hole's there now. And if I don't start this project, I'm going to have to either look at the hole, or my wife will be like, hey, can you fix that? Because I don't like looking at it. So it forced me to like take the next step and like, kind of demo the whole thing and then actually do the project. I think real estate is very similar to that, where if you really want to do something, whether it's Airbnb, whether it's house hacking, whether it's flipping a house, whether it's buying a long-term rental, you should do it and just figure it out. Like take action. Taking action can take so many forms. Like you can call a realtor and ask them questions. That's taking action. You can get a pre-approval from a lender. That's taking action, right? You need to do both of those things before you can make an offer on the house and make the offer on the house. And probably you're going to get a no. But that's okay because you still took action and you're like excited about it, right? And then if you put in 5 offers, then one will get accepted. Great. Now you're in escrow, and what's the worst that can happen? You could walk away if the inspection report goes bad. So it's all about like taking small steps towards a really big goal.
Yeah.
I think people look at real estate as this thing that's really impossible because they see the final product of something and they're like, I could never do that. But what they don't realize is that it took like 2,000 steps to do that. And anyone can take a tiny step,
Yeah.
So that would be like my big learnings, I think, from real estate is my entire portfolio. You asked where I'm at today. I've got 35 units now. I'm trying to get to 100 by the end of 2023. It has all been a product of me just taking action and doing it and putting myself in a position that honestly made me a little uncomfortable because I didn't know what I was doing. And probably not the best legal advice, but it is good advice for people that want to get into real estate, because if you don't just put yourself out there and take a bet on yourself, like you'll never get started.
Yeah, that's really good. Number two.
Number two, oh boy. Okay. All right. Number two would be don't do it alone. So this is a really big one. Like when you're first starting, you tend to wear a ton of hats, right? You're trying to get all of the, I was at one time the cleaner and the concierge and like the restocker of toilet paper and all that kind of stuff, right? And you can do that for a little bit, but if you really want to scale and grow a lot bigger, you have to start relinquishing control. This is actually where I'm at in my current business, like all of my businesses, is hiring people to do all the things that I'm good at. And that's really hard. I think it's really hard for a lot of investors because when you're getting into it and you're trying to get into real estate, you're trying to pinch pennies and you're trying to like save as much money as possible. And when you hire someone, that means that you're making less money. But if you want to flip 10 houses, you can't do all the work yourself. You have to trust other people to do it. And number three would be just having systems and processes that dictate how you run your business. For me, I have a lot of automations in place. When I get a notification from a cleaner, that gets sent over to my assistant / property manager. She will then order new toilet paper. It gets delivered. She lets my cleaner know. It's all an ecosystem that's based on having certain ways that you run your business and documenting them. Like I didn't have anything documented for a really, really long time. So when I was training my assistant and she's like, how do you do this? I'm like, I can't verbalize it. I just do it. And so like, creating looms and like spreadsheets and, back in the day when I was analyzing properties, I was just kind of like looking and adding it up on my calculator and stuff like that. And now I have, 3 or 4 different types of spreadsheets that analyze different things, right?
Yeah.
That for me is a system and a process. Like I don't just buy a house because it looks cool. That's not always true. Sometimes I do because I know that it's going to, I know it's going to do well, but I pop that house into my spreadsheet. I run the numbers, I pencil things out, and my process for doing that ensures that when I close on it and I list it on Airbnb, I'm going to make money, right? So 1, take a bet on yourself, take action. 2, hire people, don't do it alone. And 3, have systems and processes in place so that and document them so that whenever you're hiring people and scaling up your business, you can refer them to literature on how your business runs.
Yeah, no, the SOPs are very important for any business, I think. And I actually use Loom too. And Loom is just where you can screen record your screen
You're in the bottom of it.
and you see your face too. And you can just show people, like, here's the process. For example, here's me using the spreadsheet and showing me assessing whether this is a good property or not to buy, right?
Mhm.
I'm sure people come to you and say, well, what you're doing with real estate investing is really cool, but I don't have any money to start. What do you say to them?
So there are different ways that you can do it, right? I think you can find a mentor that can teach you. I mean, I don't think that there's anything wrong with learning how to do what you want to do. But at the same time, my start really came out. I mean, I think my first, like that apartment I was telling you about, I furnished it with like $2,000, and I was like that person that drives down an LA neighborhood and sees like an IKEA counter or a wardrobe, and I'm like, we got to stop and then load it in the truck, right? So I was really scrappy with it. So there are definitely affordable ways to get into it, but you can find a mentor. You can find someone that's doing what you want to do and help them and provide value and say, hey, I see that you're flipping this house. Can I help you do it? You don't have to pay me. And then therein lies the rub, right? Doing free work. A lot of people want to make money, but they're not willing to a lot of the times do the work that goes into it, right? They see that end goal of like, man, I want to make $1 million in real estate. But sometimes you do have to do free work for a long
Yeah.
time for people, right? Picking their brain. Like if someone wants to sit down and ask me questions about Airbnb, right? Like I'm like, okay, I could answer that for like 5 hours, or I'll show you how to do it, right? Obviously, like I'm not doing that all the time now, but when I was
Yeah, you got people running
I
to
was
you being
about to
like,
say,
can I,
let me caveat
can I
that. But
shadow you?
for people that are in the industry that, have like 1 to 5 units, they need the help, right? So if you go to someone that has an Airbnb and say, hey, can I help you run these? I just want to learn. And, maybe you can make money from doing it, right? Like that's one way to do it. Putting yourself out there. The way I scaled up my portfolio is I didn't have money to go out and buy houses. I really didn't. Like like my tiny houses were all bootstrapped, truly. Like I, had to go diving into my couches to get the money. But when I actually started partnering with people, I just put myself out there. This is before I started a YouTube channel, all that stuff. I was always posting about my Airbnbs. I was always talking about my success, doing it, like not in a braggy way, but like hey,
Yeah.
I'm proud of what I built. And I had friends that reached out and they were like, hey, I've got money. I see that you're doing Airbnb. I don't know how to do it, but like if I paid for it, would you help me do this? And I was like, yeah. And so I bought, I partnered up with friends and bought like that cabin in the Smokies that I told you. Another friend of mine, we were in improv together here in LA. And after a show, he was just like, "Hey man, so you're into real estate, right?" And I was like, "Yeah," because he just saw like a post on my Instagram. He's like, "Dude, I've always wanted to do it. I've got like 100K. Show me how to do it and I'll pay for it and we'll be 50-50 partners." And I was like, "Great." And on the way to this podcast, I just got off the phone with him with like houses, talking about houses that we're going to build together. So
That's cool.
we're still in business together now, right? But I put myself out there and made kind of like, real estate part of my personality and my identity. That way, when people think of real estate, they think of me, right? They came to me and they would offer me money. So I think you could have no money and offer to help somebody, or you could have no money and go to someone that wants to get into it and say, hey, I'll be the sweat equity. I'll do all the work if you fund it. And, you'll never have to like worry about it kind of thing. And that's how I built up most of my portfolio. Most of my portfolio has been working with partners or investors.
In real estate investing, give me your top 3 tips for minimizing risk.
So this is going to be a little bit of contradictory to my other tip of like just taking action and not having analysis paralysis, but I do think that you can educate yourself, right? Like you can learn, and I think that's really important. I just think at the moment where you're consuming a lot of content and a lot of education and you don't feel like like the moment you feel like you're sort of plateauing
Mhm.
out with the education that's available to you, that's when I think you should jump in. But first, you have to do that, right? You have to have the education. So I would say learn as much as you can, read books, listen to podcasts like Bigger Pockets, obviously, YouTube channels, and find people that are doing what you want to do, right? When I say just jump into it, take action, that assumes that you've done a little bit of homework, right? All the times that I jumped into it, I did enough homework to be like, I think I can figure it out, once the test comes. And I did. So educate yourself and just make sure that you have everything down from like a conceptual level. 2 would be analyze your deals very conservatively, especially if you're working with other people. I mean, I think that's really going to be the biggest way to de-risk anything. When I'm analyzing my own properties, I'm willing to take swings. I'm currently looking at a property. I'm in escrow on a property in Denver that at a baseline should break even. It will break even if in a medium case scenario. Could lose money, but in the best case scenario, I think it can make $70,000 a year. And so I'm willing to take that risk because I'm like, it's my house and I love it. And I think that it can make great content for me. And I think it's going to be inspiring for people and I can make money. So I'm cool to do that. But when I'm working with an investor, I would never take that deal.
Mhm.
So I think you have to learn to let go of deals very quickly when other people's money is on the line. Like my rule of thumb, just from a personal standpoint, is when I'm working with an investor, when I look at an investor's dollar, like let's say I lose $1 from it for an investor, I feel like I've lost $4 of my own, right? Like that's how I try to evaluate it. So when we're doing like a repair that's like $1,000, I'm like, all right, that feels like I just lost $4,000. Like I have to put myself in that mindset so that I'm extremely conservative and extremely strict with like running things. My own properties, I can run them loose and colorful, no big deal. Working with an investor, you got to be like really, really conservative. Tip number 3, have multiple exit strategies. I think that's super, super important. Some people go into short-term rentals and that's the only thing that they want to do and that's all they want, but they haven't really considered ways to get out of it in case there's regulation, in case anything happens, right? And so for me, when I'm comping out a property, especially short-term rentals, I'm trying to say, okay, if I buy this Airbnb and let's say it gets regulated from a city, can I convert it to a medium-term rental? Yes. Will I still make money? Yes. Can I convert it to a long-term rental? Yes. Okay. In the case that those don't work, can I sell it and get my money back through the appreciation? Yes, I can. Okay, great. I'm going to buy this property. But if you don't have multiple ways to get out of it, then I think that's where you get into a really risky situation. Because what if you spend all your money on an investment and then it gets regulated 2 months later? Now you've spent, you know, possibly 6 figures on a down payment and $20,000, $30,000 on furniture. Now you got to figure out what to do, right? And if you sell it, you might lose money if you had just purchased it like in the last 3 months. And so not having a backup plan there makes it really, really tough. So I try to analyze my deals to work for about 3 or 4 different scenarios. And that for me makes me feel good because I know, hey, if it doesn't work out as an Airbnb, I'll convert it to a medium term rental like I did with my house here in LA.
No, that makes a lot of sense. For first time real estate investors, do you recommend that they do it in the city that they live in, or do you have specific cities in the US that you think are very good cities to be investing in right now?
I'm a big fan of investing in your backyard. And when I say that, I don't literally mean your backyard, although I actually did literally start in my backyard. But I think anywhere 2 to 2.5 hours away from where you live is fine when you're getting started. Just because I think feasibly, from a mental standpoint, you can jump in a car and you can drive to that house if anything goes wrong and really check on it. Anything outside of that isn't super feasible. 4 hours is not just something you can do, right? That's like an 8 hour round trip thing. So for me, when I was building that house in Joshua Tree, I was like, it's 2.5 hours away. If it burns down, I can get there really fast, kind of thing. I never went out there once, but it was nice to know that I could. This is something that I've learned from co-host of Bigger Pockets, David Green. Long distance investing, very, very possible to do that as long as you have what we call your core four, which is like your contractor, your realtor, your loan officer, and your handyman, something like that, right? Those are the people that are really running your properties. And it's the same thing with Airbnb. I call them my Airbnb Avengers. Don't come after me, Marvel. But this is like my cleaner, my handyman, my landscaper, my pool guy, and probably my contractor. We'll put them in there. And when anything goes wrong in my properties, they're the ones that are going to fix it, right? Like I had a roof leak in my tiny house in Joshua Tree. I don't know how to fix a roof leak, and it was leaking from the ceiling. Who did I call? My contractor. Who did he call? His roof guy. They fixed it, right? So I think the idea of investing long distance is like really scary. Maybe you don't have to start there. I think starting in your backyard is pretty good. Like I think you should
Mhm.
do that. But you could get to long distance investing very quickly because if you have people that you can depend on, they're the ones that are going to fix anything that goes wrong. I mean, at the end of the day with real estate, what you're asking is who, not how. Who's going to fix this problem, not how am I going to fix it?
Yeah. What other advice do you have for first timers who are just getting started?
My favorite, I kind of talked about this at the beginning of the podcast, but I'm a really big fan of house hacking. I really am. I mean, I house hacked twice or 3 times really. When I lived in Kansas City, my mortgage was $1,100. Buddy moved to town. He was like, I'll pay you $400 to live there. I remember he Venmoed me $400. This was, at that time I was not making a ton. And I remember that $400 was like life changing. I was like, oh my gosh, we can like get double steak at Chipotle, like that was like a big deal,
Add the
right?
avocado.
And I could do the walk and it's extra and it's okay. But I think house hacking is really great. And I attribute house hacking to the catalyst of my entire portfolio. So for people that are really scared to get into real estate, I think it's a very achievable way to do it. You can buy a house that you were going to buy anyways, rent it to tenants or to friends or to whoever, learn how to do that, learn how to get a lease going. And I think you'll be like, oh, okay, the money's really great. I'm subsidizing my mortgage. I think I can do this again, but long distance or like, across town or whatever. So to me, I think house hacking is the greatest tool for unlocking wealth. Truly, I do.
So the podcast is called Erika Taught Me, but really today is all about Rob. So what do you want people to walk away from this podcast being able to say, Rob taught me this?
I want people to listen to this and say, Rob taught me that a regular person, anybody out there can get started in real estate. That's all I want. Like I try to make real estate approachable to the everyday person. That's my mission in all things that I do.
I love that. You've done a great job today. Thank you.
Thanks. I tried. I did my best.
If you want to see more from Rob, you can subscribe to his YouTube channel or listen to his podcast, Bigger Pockets. I'll leave the link to both in the show notes. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, please take a moment to leave a review. It really helps support the work that we're doing. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next Tuesday on a brand new episode of Erika Taught Me.